I'm Richard Cowlings, and I'm going to talk about subjects on which apparently Scrum is silent. Users and customers and your Agile project. In researching this, I found a blog that talked about the missing users in Agile, and the guy who wrote it said apparently the word user and the word customer doesn't get mentioned once in the Scrum guide. There's references to stakeholders occasionally, but it's entirely silent on user and customer integration in your project. And so what I'm going to... There seems to be a consensus, and the evidence seems to point to the fact that doing Agile in organisations, and particularly complex organisations, is difficult. Last year's version 1 State of Agile report, when people asked what the challenges were, the thing that came top of the list is company philosophy or culture is at odds with core Agile values. And certainly my own anecdotal experiences, I quite often go to the London Agile discussion group, which is quite a good way of hearing people's experiences from the front line. And the common theme that runs through a lot of the sessions is generally we're doing Agile well and it's working. The big problem is working with the rest of the organisation, working with the users, working with the stakeholders, working with managers. What I'm going to specifically talk about is, and where I think it gets even more difficult, is working in organisations where technology is a means to an end rather than an end in itself. This was an insight that I got from Jeff Patton. I was reading a blog of his, and he said this very thing. And for me, that was a real light bulb moment, because there were aspects of Agile in terms of my work and my practice that I thought, I don't see how that can work in the context in which I work. And to illustrate the context in which I work, the picture there is from a project I worked on a few years ago, which is, I work in the not-for-profit sector with organisations that are delivering complex services, helping them acquire and implement and design and roll out systems to support service delivery. So this is a group of refugee advisors. I was working with a consortium of organisations that work with and support refugees and asylum seekers. And this particular group were reviewing a pilot stage that we'd run. And the key thing that I think is challenging about doing Agile in this context is that we were building a new case management system for them. And we had a couple of objectives for this. One was that we wanted to have a system that would give us a much more holistic picture of refugees and asylum seekers' experience in this country, but also for the frontline staff to give them something that when they opened up a case, they could immediately see what the issues were for this client. There's a big problem with case management systems in the sort of social services arena, where there's a lot of data being captured, but in terms of supporting the caseworkers, it's really difficult for them when they're dealing with a case, and we see it with things like the Baby P case and so on. Actually understanding what's going on is really difficult. And we'd come up with some ideas that were quite radical in terms of how to address those problems. But the implication was that it was going to mean a big change in the way that people worked. And for me, that is where the challenge lies in doing Agile in that sort of context, is that you're actually designing or working with people around changing the way in which they're going to work. And I'll come back and talk a bit more about that in a moment. The other challenges are that they all had day jobs, they all had really challenging day-to-day jobs, and finding the time to participate in design processes and so on is really difficult. And they weren't technically illiterate, but they didn't eat, sleep and breathe technology in the same way as people do as I would envisage, in companies like Ocado, Amazon and so on. You know, they had some knowledge of what was possible, but it wasn't something that they thought about all the time. So what I'm going to look at are some of the challenges in doing Agile in the sort of context that I've just described. Talk through what I found to be helpful thinking and theory, and throw in a few ideas of my own, and talk a little bit about techniques that I found useful. When I ran through this, I prepared far too much, and I've had to really cut it back. So I'll touch on a couple of techniques that I found useful, but there's a whole list of other ones that I'll put up at the end, which I haven't had time, there's just not simply time to cover. That's me. That was a picture my son drew of me. Just a little bit about myself. As you can probably gather, I've worked in IT for about 40 years now, slightly scarily. The last 25 years of which have been as an independent, doing the sort of project that I've just described. I feel a bit nervous doing this because I wouldn't describe myself as an Agile expert. I don't have a single certification. When I went into IT, part of the reason I went into it was because at that time you didn't need to do exams. I'd gone through university, I got an engineering degree. I didn't want to do any more exams, so I've managed to get this far without getting any certifications. I wouldn't claim to be an expert. My experience comes from working on, there's two things I think I do bring to this. One is that most of the projects I get involved with, I see them right from the beginning. An organisation comes to me and says, we've got this problem, would you help us with us? And I work with them right the way through that project, from sort of scoping it out, helping them typically find a development partner and a platform, design, implementation, and rolling it out, and then quite often spending a year or two sometimes. They keep me on to actually help with further developments on. So I see projects from sort of the soup to nuts. And the other thing is that I'm very much embedded with the users. I work quite closely with the developers, but I see projects very much from a user experience, from the user side of things. The other thing is that I'm a bit of a contrarian. I don't like being, and part of the reason I'm independent, I don't like being told what to do. Similar for me with methodologies, that I sort of pick ideas and concepts from different methodologies, and I don't always follow. There may be some things in here that you think, actually, I don't agree with that, and I'm willing to have that conversation. And the final bit of this is, I don't know if anybody's come across the book, The Neo-Generalist. I always find it difficult to describe what I do because I don't have a specialization. I cover lots of different areas. And when I saw this, and I saw this particular quote from it, I felt, actually, that's my ambition, is to bring ideas from lots of different areas together and try and make something a little bit more holistic from that. So in terms of the challenges, I'm just going to pick 2 or 3 things. One of which is, in the sort of environment I'm working in, there's an issue around who is the product owner. On the refugee project, as I said, it was a project involving a consortium of organisations, so there was no one person that one could go to. There was no one single subject matter expert that one could go to and say, right, you're the product owner. You also get the other problem, which this particular story will illustrate. One of the projects I worked on a while ago now was for the RSPCA. They get 1.5 million calls a year, which go from my hamster's off his food, through my neighbour's beating his pit bull dog, through to a lorry's crashed on, this is from the police, a lorry's crashed on the M1 and we've got 1,000 loose chickens, help. And they had basically a set of call centres that dealt with those, and they needed a new system to support that. They had an existing system, and they asked me to come in and look at that system and look at what the problems were. And there were multiple problems, one of which was the fact that it had this bizarrely intricate coding system so that you could code a particular incident down to the finest detail. And the joke on the subsequent project, which is illustrated by this, was that you could encode the fact that there was this is I think a kestrel that was attached to some rugby posts by its jesses. It was just this very intricate coding system. And this was a real problem in terms of practical day-to-day use, because the staff in the call centres are often dealing with people who are quite stressed, either very upset because they've lost their cat, or quite angry because they've had an inspector call who's alleging that some act of cruelty, and they've been told to phone the call centre, and quite often people can be very hostile in that sort of situation. And so having to try and find the relevant codes for a particular case was really difficult. And on top of that, there was a further problem, which is illustrated by one of the calls they got from somebody who said, I've got this big black and white cat that's stuck in my shed and is very aggressive. And so Inspector went, can you come and do something about it? Inspector goes along. Turns out the big black and white cat is actually a badger. The great British public's ability to identify animals is not very good. So why did this happen? And the reason it happened was because they did have, the term didn't exist at that time, but essentially the developers worked with a senior inspector, and this particular senior inspector was the person who was responsible for all the stats. So he was very interested in trying to capture all this data. But what it didn't reflect was the frontline experience or the frontline needs of the call centre staff. And this represents, this is one of the challenges that one has in working in an agile environment, which is that you've got multiple stakeholders with different requirements. And if you just go to one person and use them as your subject matter expert, you end up with the sort of problem that I've just described. Other problems, some of which I've talked about already. You get different and conflicting requirements. You've got the problem of organisational politics. Managers, if you want to find out what goes on in an organisation, the last person to go and ask typically is a manager. They have the bigger picture, but often they don't really understand the detail of what their staff are doing. Frontline staff are very good in that respect, but often they don't have the bigger picture and the vision in terms of where you want to go. Quite often the problems are that you've got processes that run across multiple departments and nobody's got a complete picture. You've got complex interconnections, cross-organisational problems. I've already touched on the fact of limited understanding of the technical possibilities. People often have a very fixed way, this is the way we do it, and for them to see alternatives is quite challenging. Touched on the fact that people already have a day job. And another issue, most of the projects I work on, is you have a big, fat, old legacy system that it's almost impossible to find a way of replacing it incrementally. So doing agile in that context becomes more difficult. So those are some of the issues. Something else I have an issue with in terms of sort of the agile approach is putting users and developers together. And again, I'll illustrate that with another story from the RSPCA project. Because of the experience with the previous system, they did a really good thing, and this was my first experience of engaging with really getting users involved in the design of a system. They decided that they would not only bring in people from across the different bits of the organisation, but they would actually budget for this to free those people up so they could actually participate much more effectively in the process. So we assembled a diagonal slice across the organisation of people from different levels and different regions and brought them together and involved them in the selection of the system, in the requirements and the selection of the development partner. And then we kicked off with the development partner and we got the development team down, we got all the users in the room to talk about the initial piece of functionality that was going to be implemented. And within about 15 minutes, we had a situation where the developers were sat up one end of the room, literally twiddling their thumbs, whilst the users argued vociferously amongst themselves in terms of how this particular function worked, because basically each region had quite a high degree of autonomy. and the way in which they worked was quite different. And it was clear that what they each wanted, we'd done some high-level requirements, but how the detail of, when we got into the detail of this, it was clear that there were lots of differences. And I think it was valuable for the developers to be involved in this. And there was I'm not saying don't involve the developers with the users, because I think it is really valuable for devs to see some of the issues with the users. And if I had a bit more time, I would talk a bit more about some of the things that I've used on some of my projects. So the initial session was very useful, and there was an ongoing program of contact. But what we decided in terms of these expensive resources that were in many, who are in many respects much better off programming, was that I would take on the responsibility of working with the users to resolve what it was that was needed, work with the developers, and there was a sort of, I took on I know in some agile circles this is frowned on, but took on this sort of intermediary role, but which actually worked out really well. I mean, that system went live. It was, dare I say, a traditional waterfall project, but because we had that user involvement, it went live, it ran successfully for a couple of months without any major issues, and in fact it's still being used 15 years later by the organisation. So I have some issues around putting devs together with users on a sort of full-time basis, and I'll come back and talk a bit more about that later. And something that I feel very strongly about is that I have real doubts about the show and tell piece. I don't use it on my projects, and there is some, in terms of my experience, some anecdotal evidence. I was at a conference the other day, in a sort of charity IT tech conference, and I was talking to somebody from one of the big charities, and they've just built a new fundraising system, and they'd used agile techniques. And she said, we did the show and tell, and the users sort of said, that looked great. And then when they came to do the user acceptance testing, they all were bringing up issues and saying, this isn't going to work, we've got lots of problems. Show and tell may work in a context where you've got experienced product owners, but I think there are other techniques, which I'll talk about in a moment, where you need, next slide, in fact. The reason it doesn't work is this. You may recognize this as the Gartner Curve, or the Gartner Hype Curve. But in my experience, when you show a system to people, initially you get this very positive reaction. They see all the bells and whistles, the dashboards, all the new features that it's going to bring. It's only when you sit down and get them to use it in terms of what they would be using it for, practical day-to-day use, that the problems start to emerge. And they need time, and you need space in which to explore those things. And if you do that, then you can start to find, you get partly, sometimes their negative reactions are ones that it's actually, as they start to realize what that enables, they see the value of it. In other cases, you realize, actually, we need to make some further adjustments to the system. And hopefully the curve starts to turn up again and things get better. But in my experience with most systems, there is this sort of pain point, and it's good to establish that sooner rather than later. So those are some of the problems. Want to talk a little bit about some theories and principles and ideas. My starting point is in the sorts of projects that I work on, and I think I've met several people here. If you're working in an organisation which is delivering services, is government agencies, local authorities, and I think commercial organisations as well, insurance companies, that sort of thing, value is actually delivered not by the technology, it's actually delivered by people working together. And if you're going to increase the value, then there's going to be a change process. And the technology can facilitate that, but it's really about making that change process as smooth as possible that will actually deliver the value. And so leading on from that, I don't know how many of you went to the BDD presentation from Liz Keogh this morning, but how many people know what this is? Okay, less than I thought, but this is the Cynefin model. Cynefin is a Welsh word, and it's a sense-making model, and it's a way of looking at problems and understanding what the best approach is for dealing with this particular problem. One could spend a whole session just talking about this. I'm just using it as an introduction to talk specifically about complex problems. But on the right-hand side, you've got what are called ordered problems, where there's a direct relationship between cause and effect. If you do X, Y happens. If you do X again, Y happens again. You've got predictability. And Dave Snowden, who came up with this, splits it into obvious and complicated. And on this side, if you're working with these sorts of problems, traditional waterfall works. And that's not me saying that. Dave Snowden actually says that. Then down in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got chaotic problems, which is sort of crisis situations, where there's no relationship between cause and effect. And in this sort of, these are sort of fires, your system's gone down, all the servers are not working. In this context, if you look at the blue things here, the model is act, sense, response. So you do something, see whether that's working, and if it's not, then you adjust it. And then the area that is of interest in terms of this presentation is the complex area, which is where the relationship between cause and effect is only obvious in retrospect. And complex systems, complex problems are things like flocks of starlings, shoals of fish, hurricanes, economic systems, and basically anything involving people. So if you're rolling a system out to an organization, that organization consists of people, so basically you're dealing with a complex problem. In complex systems, context is everything. What has a meaning in one context can have a completely different meaning in a different context. And in the same way, what works in one context doesn't necessarily work in a different context. Characteristics of complex systems is that you've got multiple objects that are interacting with each other. So in an organization, you've got people, you've got departments, etc., all of which are interacting with each other. And the behavior of the overall system is largely driven by those interactions. And you've got a lot of learning taking place. I did a development review for a charity in terms of how they were developing systems, and there was a conversation I had with one of the users looking at what their experience had been of working on a particular project. And she said to me, if I knew all the stuff that I know now about developing this particular function, I would have said completely different things at the beginning. And that's a good thing. Learning is a good thing, but it means that as your project is proceeding, the rules and the way in which people interact is changing, which is the next point. Context sensitive, I've talked about. Not reversible is basically it's that thing of you can't unsee something. In complex systems, if you release a system and it's a pile of whatever the right expression is there, you can't say to people, actually pretend we didn't do that. That the word has already got out, and people have already altered their view, and you can't undo those things. And one of the things about Agile is there is a sort of assumption, if something doesn't work, you can back it out and try something different. But in complex organizations, we all know that rumor spreads really quickly. And there's a whole issue around how people feel about new developments and so on. Dispositional means that things are easier to change in one direction than perhaps in another. And one of the things that Dave Snowden says about complex systems is understand where you are now and see what you can change easily. And I think that's a really useful tip in terms of sort of facilitating change. Small changes can have a big impact. And the other thing around complex systems is that solutions emerge. You may have some ideas, but it's through that sort of iterative and as he talks about experimental approach, that you find solutions that actually work. So that's all good stuff, but it has implications. What I missed off when we were talking about the Cynefin model was in the blue section. The model was probe, sense, respond. And if you're to work effectively with complex problems, the sense and respond bit are critical. And in the sort of projects that I'm involved with, and I suspect some of you may be as well, some of the people I've talked to have met here already, stakeholders need to assess and feedback, and they need time to do that, and they need time to assess the impact of how this new system is going to impact their work. And we need to listen and observe, and all of this takes time to see whether it's working or not. Another reason for slowing down, this isn't meant to be readable, but certainly, I can't remember whose presentation, it was in Stefan, I think, was talking about cognitive biases. This is, if you Google the Cognitive Bias Codex, this is a guy that drew this diagram of all the different cognitive biases. I forget how many there are on here. There's, I think, over 100 different cognitive biases. And this goes a bit against what Gert was saying this morning, that very often I think people's initial reactions are not necessarily ones that they will alter over time. So again, what people say about something initially is not what they'll say once they've had a chance to use it. So where I'm heading with this is that slow can be better. It builds understanding, it allows you to build consensus, it facilitates engagement, gives people thinking time, and critically, and it builds trust. If people trust what you're doing, then they build confidence in how the system is going to help them with their work. It allows ideas to be explored, and it reduces exhaustion. I don't know whether this was touched on in the neuroscience presentation today, but I watched the video about neuroscience and Agile, and the woman giving it said, change is exhausting. And you can see when people are dealing with situations they're not used to, that the whole brain lights up. So you're asking your users, in terms of participating in a change project, it is exceptionally draining for them. And if I get a chance, I'll draw something up at the board at the end. The counterintuitive thing is that, in my experience, actually sometimes delivering things a bit more slowly and engaging with people, you actually end up delivering value more quickly, because what's important is not delivery, or in theory at least, what's important is not delivery, it's about value. Although interestingly, when I was looking again at the version 1 document, the State of Agile thing, the thing in terms of how Agile projects were measured, something like, the top one was velocity. 60-70% of projects were measured in terms of velocity. Customer and user satisfaction, 20% of projects are measured on that. And business value was even worse. So what we have, I think, is maybe, if this is to be believed, an Agile world which is still focused on delivering lots of functions. Whether people are actually happy with those functions, whether they're actually delivering business value, is secondary. Another thing that I think is important that may get, in some Agile methodologies, it allows for sort of spikes and things, but in my view, and there was a really good example of this in the land registry presentation earlier this afternoon, some time spent understanding the landscape you're working in, I think, can be really valuable. And I feel that on the projects I've worked on, we've tended to do that, and that's really helped. In the land registry thing, they were looking at making their systems much more, exposing them much more to their to what they call the citizens, and they had done a whole exercise where they'd mapped out the procedures, the processes, And what that then enabled them to do was they then took a little piece of it and said, this is the one that we're going to work on. But because they had both all the end-to-end procedures and they could see the commonalities, they were able to identify which functions potentially could be shared across the different processes. And when they were building them, they could take into account the requirements of those other processes. Another reason for understanding the landscape is this diagram, which I nicked off a tweet from Tobias Fors, which is that the problem on most projects is that you're making all these big decisions up front, but the problem is, as I've talked about already, that you're right at the beginning of the learning curve. So, and if you get those big decisions wrong, then it's going to have a major impact on the projects that I work on. You know, we're choosing a development partner, we're choosing a development platform. Those sorts of things, if you get them wrong, it's going to be really costly to the project. So some initial understanding. I am definitely not arguing for traditional big upfront development, but maybe big upfront design. Some initial work to understand the landscape, to understand what's over that hill, I think is really valuable. And it then allows you to build flexible architectures that where you know the dimensions on which things, I mean, going back to the refugee project, we did an exercise to look at a number of different projects around the country in the different organisations, and what that then allowed us to do was build a generic model, a sort of theoretical model that allowed, which could cater for all those different requirements. And then when we started to build, we would just build a little bit of it, but over time, that model didn't need to change very much. This is the Lloyd's building. I don't know if people are aware of this, but it's designed because when Richard Rogers was building it, the Lloyd's committee said, we've had a number of very expensive buildings built over the years, and what we found is that we've had to, their value to us has expired more quickly because we've changed as an organisation and our building hasn't been able to change with us. With this one, because all the services and everything are on the outside, you can apparently change it. And I think Carl Scotland said we should rewrite the Agile Manifesto. I don't know his exact words, but basically it's more about building systems that are agile, that can support change, rather than necessarily building them in an agile way. It just about shows up. I'm learning to draw again, so I apologise for the bad handwriting, but the model that in thinking about this, I've come up with this model of, you've got this process in the middle. I mean, there are lots of different variations, the lean startup model and so on. It's all about doing something, seeing whether it's working, and then adjusting what you're doing and doing more. But what I've put into this picture are the different stakeholders, and each one of those stakeholders they're contributing stuff to the project, but they're also learning. And again, these processes need time to work, I think. You need time to absorb, has that worked? What can we learn from it before moving forward? And down in the bottom left-hand side, I've got this concept of a solution team. If you're working in the sort of context in which I'm working, where you don't necessarily have one person who can act as the product owner, the term I've got to describe this is a small team of people that bring together the skills. And I know for Scrum, the Scrum Guide, and I was listening to Dave West, the Scrum.org product owner, and he's very firmly of the view that you need the one ringable neck. But I think because of the complexity of the problems that you're dealing with, a small team that brings together these skills, and it's very much about your particular context. I'm not going to go through this, but you need this combination of sort of subject matter understanding, analytical skills, and what's possible with the technology. On my most recent project, there were 3 of us. There was myself, who provided the sort of architectural business analysis side of things, but we had a really good subject matter expert who had worked in quite a number of different departments and was enormously valuable in terms of guiding our initial thinking, and we had a senior dev. And we worked together, collaborated really closely in terms of working on the design of the system. And what we had was the model that, in the way that I would see it, is that the solution team is overlaps with the dev team, overlaps with the users, and that you still, I think it's, as I've said already, I think there is real value in devs engaging with the user. I mean, one of the things I try and do is, that particularly for devs that are heavily involved, is arrange for them to come and shadow. I mean, on the refugee project, we got one of the leading devs to come down and spend half a day in one of the advice centres to sort of understand actually what it was like to be a caseworker. And often, I mean, one of the things that I think happens with Agile, it's all about the customer coming to the team, but I think actually the team going to the customer is really valuable, and seeing what the real life experiences of the people who are going to be using your system, what that is like. I don't have time to go into this in detail. I mean, these slides will all be uploaded and available, but what I've done here is just list out what each of these groups sort of contribute to that probe, sense, respond process, and what they get back. So very quickly, I picked out a couple of techniques, and then I've got a list at the end. So one technique, who's come across dual track Agile? Okay, not that many, but on the two most significant projects I've worked on in the last few years, we started off doing Agile very much, the aim was to build functionality really quickly and get it in front of the users, to give them experience. And we ran, on the refugee project, we ran 2-day user trials where we'd got people in from around the country and exposed some really rubbish software to them. It was a long way off being working software, but through careful sort of management of their expectations, we learnt, and we had the senior dev there as well. We learnt a lot from that, and we built iteratively very quickly. But what we found over time was that because of the issues I talked about with the devs and the stakeholders, often you need to spend time up front with the stakeholders, working out what it is they want, particularly resolving conflicting requirements, trying to find some way through where everybody gets enough of what they need to be reasonably happy, and more importantly, perhaps understands why they're not getting the functionality that they would like, but they understand why for other stakeholders that would be a problem. So we moved into this model where you have two separate sort of processes going on, a sort of discovery process and the development process. And we were doing this, and then I came across this article by Jeff Patton. And if you Google it, there are a number of articles which describes an iterative process of coming up with ideas, testing them on paper or in a variety of different ways, and then using that to feed into the development backlog. I'm almost there. And then the second thing in terms of techniques, and which I've already touched on. Anybody know where this is? Any Glaswegians here? It's probably a bit too far for them to come, isn't it? It's the Red Road estate the notorious Red Road estate in Glasgow. It was the one they were going to blow up for the Commonwealth Games. And the reason, at the time, it was built in the 60s, and at the time it was the tallest social housing in Europe, 30 stories high. And I spent 2 months on the 29th floor of this when it was being used. That block was being used to house asylum seekers, and there was an advice centre at the top. And we ran this was after doing those user acceptance tests, we ran a much more intensive 2-month pilot, again using software that was a long way off being production quality. But I would sit in with the caseworkers on their sessions, and then we would go and use the system. And We could see what was working, what wasn't working. We had a hotline to the devs, so we were turning stuff around really quickly. And it was out of that experience that we essentially, what you saw at the beginning, the picture with the group round the table, we had people come from different parts of the country to see how it was working. And out of that, we got a broad consensus that this was heading in the right direction, despite the fact that it was actually quite a radical change for people. And we went on subsequently to build a system that was rolled out successfully across the 3 organisations and the multiple projects. Almost done. As I say, I don't have time to go through. There's lots of other techniques that I can talk about at some other stage possibly, but I'll just list them there. And final, this is not very tweetable, but trying to pull all of this together. In some, it's again all about context. In some organisations and in some situations, value is delivered by change. And change that works, in my view, depends on building trust with your user community. It depends, and to build that trust, you need their effective engagement in the process, and you need to be doing lots of small-scale experiments that they're involved with. All of this takes time, and therefore, up to a point, doing things more slowly actually delivers value faster. I think there's a point where you can go too far, and you get into the whole gold plating stuff and so on. But the reality, the reason for doing things more slowly is not to get the software right, it's to get the user engagement right, the mindset right, the trust right. And if people know what to expect, understand why it's being done, have been involved in the design processes themselves and own it, then the actual rollout of the system will be much easier and you'll deliver value faster. Done. Have we got time for questions? And it's almost... Anybody? I mean, I'm happy, as I say, some of the things may be a bit contentious. I'm happy to have that conversation. It's difficult. I mean, what I was going to draw up, let me just quickly draw up the thing I was planning to draw up, which was, and this was based on a particular project. We had 2 phases, and the first project we did really quick. The first phase we did really quickly, and we had lots of issues. The second one, I went to the senior stakeholder, and I said, actually, if we'd taken that a bit more slowly, we would have had far fewer issues, and we'd have delivered value more quickly. And he agreed. But it is a difficult argument. But the curve that you might find useful is you've got, over time, in the lead up to, this is going live, you've got issues that are probably building up. And then when you go live, you get a whole stack of issues that over time will sort of decline. And alongside that, you've got value. So prior to going live, it's going, because your staff are all involved in testing and so on, so they're being less productive, and you go live and it gets even worse. And then slowly, you start, as you resolve the issues, the users get more used to the system, you get to a point where basically you get into positive territory value-wise. And the argument that you can use is that by taking a bit longer, you can make that issue, you have fewer issues when you go live, and consequently the speed at which you actually get to the point where you're starting to deliver real value. If you've engaged with the users, I was talking to a guy earlier, and he was saying, they do little pilot projects, but then when they try to roll stuff out more widely, they get lots of issues. If you've got user engagement and user buy-in, you've taken the time to build up the confidence with the people, then the number of issues, the number of problems that you have when you go live will be a lot less. But it's a difficult argument to make. I think the curve looks like this, incidentally, in terms of so in terms of time to deliver, versus, no, have I got that right? No, hang on, I've got that wrong. But basically, there's an optimal time. You can take too long. If you spend too long gold plating stuff, then you lose the benefit. By sometimes taking a bit longer to involve the users really delivers, I think, delivers benefits and means you deliver value faster.
I think a good example of that is with EA Games and their alpha testing, getting users involved, because they've released games in the past that have had a huge amount of issues on launch,
Yeah.
and a massive amount of complaints. They just put loads of people buying the next one. And so they've implemented a lot more forums and getting people involved, getting YouTubers involved, and solving issues early on.
No. I think sometimes it is, it's slower is faster.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, everybody.